Okay, we're going to start. This panel has the tiny task of bringing this all together and suggesting some next steps. I think I'll speak for myself. When I started this meeting, my eye was on all the wonderful possibilities offered by process data and the new applications, and how administrative data was also proliferating and merging databases and doing longitudinal research, and all the new opportunities and concerns that we would be able to protect privacy in this new world, and concerns that researchers weren't necessarily being heard as that debate continues. Now I am afraid that even the research that we've already done for years may be endangered by our failure to interact with the communities that are supplying and using data. So I think my whole frame has changed, but we at the Academy are very anxious to try to find out how to operate in this new frame and what we could contribute. So I'm going to now ask each panelist, who you can read about in your statement of bios, to give a short statement of the major themes that they see have emerged from this meeting. I have a set of questions to ask them, but I have to say many of those questions already came up in other panels, but so we'll start there. So, Marie? Okay.
So I wanted to talk about one theme that I saw that emerged from the discussions that have taken place. And I think it really started with the what Andrew talked about in his paper around the research practitioner partnerships. And SRI, the company nonprofit I work for, has a couple of those grants that are from IES. They're not easy to do. It does take a lot of work to build those partnerships, setting aside your own research priorities possibly, really listening to what the needs are of the community. We're working with Clark County in Nevada, really trying to understand how we can help English language learners learn science better. And, really the district is really struggling with this problem. But those are far and few between. So I don't think that as a model is going to apply everywhere. We also do a lot of work with vendors. We take data from them. We look at back-end data. We all know it's very difficult especially in like a randomized controlled trial study. It's very difficult to understand what's going on in the classroom if all you're concerned about is, looking at outcome data. You lose that ability to explain what your outcomes are. If you have a finding that says there was no learning gain, well, what do you do with that? It's very expensive to go into the classroom and collect this qualitative data. But you can get this back-end data and do a lot of interesting work on really understanding when is it being used, is it being used outside of the classroom, what are the patterns of usage, and so on. So, so it's really important that we continue that work with these companies. But I think the major theme that I think we can take away from this, I want to call perspective taking, that we can learn from these research practitioner partnerships and work with vendors, is that everybody has to take everybody else's perspective, and unfortunately that's kind of hard work, right? So we as researchers need to understand what are the parents' concerns. I agree with the point that we don't want to say people are rational or irrational. What are the concerns of the parents? What are the concerns of the schools? I think also people need to understand what are the business models that these companies, these vendors who are collecting this data, operating under. You're getting something, you're getting software for free. Well, they're paying employees, they're paying health insurance for those employees. There has to be some business model that we understand that the company is operating under. And then from the vendor's perspective, they have to understand the concerns that we have about how our data is being used, how our children's data is being used. So I think this sort of 360-degree perspective taking that we can all work toward will really help, maybe not solve the problem in a year, but solve the problem in the years to come.
Thanks, Marie. Monica?
Thank you. I just want to say what a pleasure it's been the past 24 or so hours meeting all of you and hearing your perspectives. It's been very informative. My name is Monica Bulger, and I'm with the Data and Society Research Institute in Manhattan. And in listening to our discussions over the past 2 days, I'm struck that we're really having two different conversations. From the perspective of educational researchers, there's confusion about what the problem is because we've been engaging in the collection, storage, and use of data since before it was big data, right? Since most of us take research ethics seriously, we can explain the history of IRBs, we can talk about the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, and how IRBs came about, how data ethics came about. And we know of no instances of breaches of educational research data. And we do this research in the interest of public good, and our work has led to positive change. So when I've been talking to some of you in the break, there was actual surprise that people could be perceiving educational research, the use of data in student data in educational research as a negative thing. But from the perspective of legal scholars, parent groups, and privacy advocacy groups, there is a problem. There's a few, actually. The main problem is that researchers have done a poor job, as we've been discussing earlier, explaining the value of collecting and using student data for educational research. We don't have signposts when early education becomes a priority, or schools start serving breakfast, or teachers are paired with veteran mentors, saying this is brought to you by research from, XYZ,
Exactly.
right? It doesn't say that student data from over 100,000 kids in 45 school districts over a 5-year period have informed this new practice. It just is invisible, right? The benefits are really invisible. When things are working and working well, we're grateful, right? Or we just assume that's the status quo. A second problem is our failure to engage parents and teachers, which was also raised earlier in the process. What several failed technology rollouts have taught us, we've talked about InBloom, but there was also the LA Unified School District rollout of iPads, is that a lack of transparency breeds mistrust and misinformation. And currently, a vocal minority challenge the use of student data. And part of the reason for that is that they're conflating national testing with all educational research. They're conflating any student data collection with third-party sharing for advertising purposes. And they're conflating big data with existing practices of student tracking and infinite remediation loops. So we really need to decouple these and start showing the value proposition for our research. And a third problem is that the student, and here I'm talking mostly about K through 12 students, gets forgotten in the discussions of student data. Referring back to my first point, we need to show the value and benefit to students of this research, as was discussed in the earlier panel. Beyond that, instead of thinking of students as data points, perhaps when engaging in primary collection, researchers could use this as an opportunity, where appropriate, to talk to students and teachers about data, their lives converted to data points, and use this as a teachable moment to inspire an interest in research. I was kind of thinking like astronauts in space. We're pretty exciting too. We can show what we're doing. Have a whole new breed of excited educational researchers, and perhaps data literacy training. I'm always looking for teachable moments. Where do tech companies fit? A struggle I have with using data from learning platforms, whether they're MOOCs or personalized learning systems, is that the technology developers, for the most part, decide what will be measured, leaving educational researchers to adapt and adjust their research questions to what the technology allows. This is something we should question and push back on. While I'm sure present company excluded, often in the development cycles, educators and educational researchers are brought in at the end as an afterthought, rather than more meaningfully engaged at the outset. As those of you engaging in MOOC research will likely agree, there's a disconnect when the tech vendors decide what can and should be measured. And in our own research, when has time on task or reading, or the time that you actually read a resource been a sufficient predictor of performance pre the learning platforms. We've adjusted our research to accommodate what the systems allow. And these are the data we're analyzing because they're available. And I just have a few more points. We've spoken quite a bit about laws and legislation, and I will leave that analysis to the more capable people in the room. But I would like to say that I disagree in some part that we need new legislation. I think that we're legislating against fears and against risks of risks, but not really against any clear evidence-based harms in data use for educational research purposes. So again, this is something that came up earlier, but we really need to get in front of the fears and address those through good practice. So I think this room has the collective power to steer the conversation around data used for educational research purposes. So where do we go next, since that was part of what this panel is for? First, I'd like to say that very, very few people understand what administrative data is versus other kinds of data. What non-researchers are interested in is whether data are personally identifiable and whether at any point in the collection or use the process is going to negatively impact their kids. And are underrepresented populations disproportionately vulnerable? That's not something that we've discussed very much in this workshop. And so, for example, how might disciplinary records be used for research, that are used for research purposes, impact future opportunities? So I think we're doing a decent job of communicating the value of our research to each other, but we have to do better, and we need to do better. So we talked about training for researchers to better communicate the value of their research. I think we also need best practice guidelines for engaging schools and evaluation criteria for what success looks like in terms of safeguarding student privacy. We need to face the myths. We need to discuss the long and productive history of use of student data in educational research, because that story is not being told, and describe what is and isn't done with student data. So next year, instead of Alana's 19 points for how student data has been used effectively in research, I'd like to see double or triple that. Why not, you know? Yeah, and those were my points, so thank you. You're welcome.
Well, thank you, and it's been a great opportunity to engage with such intellectually diverse group of people with interests in using big data in education research. First of all, how many people are on Twitter? Okay, great. So take out your phones, follow the William T. Grant Foundation, because because as I speak, we have just tweeted a link to a big part of the remarks that I'm about to make. Okay, it's about it's a blog post and a memo about how we can take advantage of great opportunities today to make better use of big data in education research, or in social science research. Okay, so I want to start with some first principles. My remarks are focused on getting more out of data we are already collecting. Whether we're talking about administrative data or learning process data, the subjects of the first two panels yesterday. By administrative data, we mean data that, in the case of our interests, school districts and states, but many other realms of our lives, as we heard in some of yesterday's panel, we are routinely collecting data. Our government is routinely collecting data to figure out who participates in what program, where people are located, how many people are located, how people are distributed, what progress people are making, whether it's in their educational or occupational or economic lives. Mountains and mountains of data are being collected. And typically we are using this only to keep track of where people are and what they're doing, and not to figure out how to serve them better. And so that's the focus of using big data. That's, I think, why we're here. The privacy, and then the other example, learning process data. So we use online tools in educational processes and in many other realms of life. And those data are all being collected. So the question is, can they be used to improve our experiences? So we heard a great example in the last panel from the parent advocate, from Olga, about how nobody asked her about putting all of her kids' data on a dashboard. And so all of the privacy issues, the security issues, the vulnerabilities we're talking about, these are all existing. This is not research creating these vulnerabilities. All these vulnerabilities already exist. So I think that's where we have to start from when we're thinking about using big data in education research. We need to recognize that these are data we're already collecting, and our mission as researchers is to try to find ways of using those data, of getting more out of the data we're already collecting. Our government asks us the same questions over and over again. Not just what our address is or what school our child attends, but lots of questions about the different institutions we encounter. We frequently have to ask the same thing. These are redundancies. It would be more efficient if we didn't have to, if we could link data sets, so we didn't have to keep asking the same questions over and over again from institution of government to institution of government and year after year. So again, the challenge that we should be addressing, I think, is how to make better use of the data we're already collecting. It would be more efficient for consumers and more efficient for service providers. It would give ways to figure out how our services are doing, whether they're succeeding or failing, in order to improve them. The key here is that the data already exists, and all the privacy and security concerns exist if researchers were never in the room. Not only that, but the extent to which vulnerabilities are increased by research as compared to the vulnerabilities that already exist should be open to question. There are thousands of breaches happening every month of data sets. The data sets that are collected in the private sector and data sets collected in the public sector, all subject to breaches. But when these breaches occur, it's not because there's some research that's addressing these that's opened up a new weak point. Those weak points already exist. And we have to understand what causes these vulnerabilities, the degree of risk, and the degree of incentives for hackers to be reaching out and grabbing information. I'm skeptical that the research use of these data, it has not been demonstrated to me that the research use of these data is creating new incentives for hackers to reach in and steal data that they can't already get through the vulnerabilities in our data security systems that already exist. There's, in fact, I would argue that the risk of breaches through research use of data is relatively low because the incentive is relatively low. Hackers are seeking data that has commercial value. They're not seeking to expose our child's IEP. That has no commercial value. So we need to weigh the incentives for data thieves. We need to weigh the incentives for data thieves and the risks that are created by research as opposed to those that already exist when we're thinking about providing access to researchers. Now, with that said, of course there are great challenges in thinking about how to use research, how to use big data responsibly in education research. We heard a great example of that in the last session from Bill Fitzgerald, the privacy expert and advocate, where data use had been approved by an institutional review board that clearly had no clue about what the real vulnerabilities to data were. For example, online data being collected, encrypted. That's step one of multiple steps. So their technology is moving faster than our ability to understand the specific needs for privacy protection. Again, that Bill's example, it's not about the research, it's about the online tool where the vulnerability exists. That vulnerability would exist whether or not the online tool were being studied. So it will take, to address these challenges, I think will take partnerships between technology experts, researchers, policymakers, and advocates, including parents and educators. Connecting some of the themes that came out in yesterday's talk with these themes that have been expressed this morning, I think there is an important federal role for promoting better use of data we're already collecting while protecting student privacy. There's a federal role in promoting a common interpretation of rules that already exist. Yesterday, one of the speakers said, if you're seeking common regulations and common rules, forget about it. And I found that to be a very frustrating comment, but looking today at the state advocate list of multiple rules across multiple states, maybe I was too quick to dismiss that as a challenge. But nonetheless, we do know that a single federal set of laws, FERPA, is interpreted variously by states, and that has resulted in grave inconsistencies among states and making data available to researchers. So we sure could use some federal leadership in what FERPA permits and what it doesn't permit, and how to set up structures for common use of for accessing big data for education research. The federal government could play a role in supporting partnerships, as the Institute for Education Sciences, incidentally, is already doing, and we heard something about that yesterday as well. These partnerships are so essential because they establish a framework for trust between researchers and practitioners. They set out standards and norms of practice that allow school districts to trust that researchers will, A, address questions whose answers will be consequential to decision making, and B, will not use the data for purposes other than those for which they've been granted. And then third, we have a huge new opportunity now with the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which was addressed yesterday as well, which is the subject of the tweet that we just sent out, so take a look for more information. As an aside, in the United Kingdom, they've shifted from the term evidence-based policymaking to evidence-informed policymaking. And I think that's, even if we're not going to use that language ourselves, I think it's good to keep in mind, because it's a reminder that policy decisions will always be made in a political context. Values, preferences will always enter the picture. Our goal is not to say that evidence should drive the policy, but rather that evidence should inform the policy. Evidence should be at the table when policies are discussed. At any rate, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking offers a tremendous new opportunity for supporting the use of big data in education research, in social welfare research, in social mobility research, in a whole variety of realms. And we've urged the Commission to take a broad view of their mandate. A narrow view might say this is about linking federal data sets. And that's an important part of the role of the Commission. But a broader view suggests that their mandate is about taking data and using it to create evidence that can be used for smarter policy decisions. So it's not just about linking data sets, it's about preparing them for use by researchers inside and outside of government. I think the Commission also needs to take a broad view of the types of research studies that can be conducted. A big part of the motivation for the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking is providing data for randomized trials, providing outcome data. So you got some program, you assign students randomly to the program, and then you don't need to collect outcome data. All the data are already there administratively, whether it's test scores or other kinds of markers of accomplishments, economic outcomes or whatever. And that can be one use of big data in education. But as we've seen over the course of this meeting, there are many purposes. So the use of data in social mobility studies, trying to understand the extent of mobility from one generation to the next, the effects of inequality in this generation on the outcomes of the next generation. using learning process information to understand how students are experiencing schooling and the new technologies that can be implemented through schooling. A wide range of studies can be done, and that should be promoted as well. Third, I hope the evidence-based policy, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking will not only talk about preparing data for evidence, but also creating the structures that support the use of data. So the kinds of research practice partnerships that are already emerging in big cities in education in the United States could be developed in a lot of other realms, including state education agencies and state child welfare agencies and other kinds of state administrative agencies. Fourth, I hope the Commission will focus on the infrastructure for using evidence for smarter policy decisions. So government offices to support evaluation, government offices to support relationships with researchers, all of that could be built up as a result of recommendations from this Commission. So I hope we'll see that coming out. Finally, I want to reiterate my suggestion yesterday about the framing of the report coming out of this conference, and which David alluded to in his introductory remarks this morning. So coming here as a researcher, the importance of balancing my needs as a researcher with protecting students' privacy seems really important. But as we think about explaining what this is about to the larger community of policymakers and advocates, I think what really needs to be balanced is the need to use data we're already collecting for smarter policy decisions on the one hand, with protecting those data from nefarious uses on the other. And that's the balance I think we need to strike. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Kristen Martin. I'm at George Washington University School of Business. I am not an education researcher. I do research on privacy, the ethics of big data, and the ethics of technology, usually within the commercial sphere, looking at businesses, what are their roles and responsibilities, what are their goals, and how do they create value. So I come here looking at it from the privacy lens and also how other places use big data. And so I have a few things that I've noticed throughout the last, I'd say, 24 hours that will be not be surprising, but I haven't talked to Monica before this, but will dovetail with what Monica suggests and like kind of teasing out certain things we might be conflating right now, and then also some possible suggestions. I should also say I am the parent of 3 children in one of the largest school systems in the nation, the Montgomery County public school system, and I am sometimes one of the vocal minority. I would only argue that the vocal minority is sometimes the only ones that take down bad teachers or advocate for the rights of others that don't have the voice within the school system or don't feel comfortable speaking out. Sometimes that's different communities. So so sometimes just because it's a small number doesn't mean that they're wrong. I would only say that. So the one thing I'd like to say is that privacy can sometimes be considered the control of information or restricted access. And the more useful definition that I've come to, which Helen Niesenbaum at NYU would use, which you call it the appropriate flow within a context. I might call it the kind of the negotiated norms of what information should be used and how within a community. So I use more of a social contract and she uses a different frame. The same idea. The idea is that the rules of how information is going to be used and gathered and shared is different based on different contexts. So in the commercial sphere, it looks different. In the education sphere, there are defined norms around how information is going to be used, how students are treated. And so in the medical field, it's different as well. And so something that's okay in one field might not be okay in another. We might consider more use within education. So sometimes that's helpful because it doesn't put privacy in tension with research. It just shows how there could be appropriate uses of information within research, and you can still respect privacy at the same time. When we frame it as restricted access or the inability or kind of holding something as a secret, then you're automatically putting in tension with research, and that doesn't have to be the case. There's a lot of appropriate uses within research as well. So a few things. One, I found it fascinating, especially yesterday, that it was harder for university researchers to get access to data inside an organization than private firms. And that bothered me yesterday. And I was surprised at the number of university researchers, and I'm going to separate university researchers with private firm research in quotes. is that they spoke of being told FERPA multiple times, and I'm not sure Google has been told FERPA by Montgomery County. So I found it interesting, the selective use of FERPA against university researchers, to say that's not possible. And that made me realize that we need to start teasing out university researchers from commercial interests in getting access to data, and how we talk about research. It might be worth separating those out. One other point that Monica actually made separately about education research in particular, but they also made yesterday, was in the healthcare arena, was that university researchers have not been the cause of a security breach in any of healthcare research, which I found fascinating, because you would think that they've been doing that longer. And so the idea was that if you're concerned about a security breach, don't look to the university researcher as a source of that security breach. Eli Lilly had an issue with an email going out and not blind copying people, which was a well-known issue that happened. And so private companies do their own work in violating security breaches just by mistakes and not on purpose. Just these are kind of common areas. But the idea would be that university researchers aren't usually going to be the source of privacy and security breaches. And private firms rightly protect their relationship with their clients. And so then I realized all of a sudden that university researchers might not be being brought in because by definition, you can't control the output of a university researcher. There's no confidentiality on what the output was. You might have confidentiality around the name of the school system, but you can't control what the results are, at least to get in a peer-reviewed journal. That's not going to happen. And we all within a university understand we don't even call it research. It's funny, we call that consulting. So when a university researcher gets money to go work for a company, that's a consulting gig. That's what we call it. We don't call that research. And so when we do research at that corporation, that's research. Then we know we can do it there, and then we put it into an academic journal. But here we seem to be kind of conflating the two things, and in a university setting, those are very distinctly different. There are similarities to business. The interesting data is within the organization. That's very true of business researchers. You have to cultivate relationships to get inside that organization to get to the interesting research. There's also interesting areas of commonality. There's aggregators, and not data aggregators in the negative sense, but companies that are pulling together information across different school systems and being able to come back and say, this is how you rate compared to your peers. That's an interesting place, rightly so, that I've talked to a few people about, where that would be an interesting place for researchers to also get access to data. And that happens in the commercial area as well. Except the data aggregators make more money because they can sell it to stockbrokers and to the banks, which I don't think the educational researchers are going to be or aggregators are going to be able to do that. But there's still an interesting parallel there in that we as researchers get access to different types of information, both in an organization and at the aggregator level. So I would say in the future, I think today we did a much better job, I thought, of differentiating K-12 versus university research. So, and that I think is an important continuation, just because I think the level of concerns of your development as a K-12 student is different slightly than a university. Also, you have the difference of it being mandatory K-12 versus not being mandatory in the university setting. They're also over 18 versus young. I mean, there's a whole lot of differences. And so I think teasing that out, K-12 public schools are also a public good funded by taxpayers. So we have a different interest in what's being used by that data and who has access to that data than they do at a university setting. Second, going forward, this difference between university versus private firms is important. IRBs I have an intimate relationship with my IRB. They can be difficult. They are getting better, especially at dealing with secondary data, and there's a movement to change IRBs around what we call here administrative data or secondary data. And so they're not perfect, though, and they will continue to get better. School systems can also put a limitation to say, this is my own version of an IRB, which they do. And so they can also place those limitations. And also, I think it's a great point that Adam made about the data that's already being collected. It'd be interesting to understand the number of research projects, even university research projects, that rely upon information already been collected, this administrative data, the secondary data, versus the research that requires someone to go in and collect survey or go in and observe a classroom. Because sometimes, as was pointed out last session, there's survey data that people will go in and ask questions of the students. And sometimes that can be a concern for parents, and I believe in the need for research. I do also understand that they might not understand it, and so I understand why they have concerns. But it'd be worth teasing out, because there's a lot of research that might be able to be done based on administrative data that will accidentally, especially with the idea of the broad Colorado bill, be swept up into the concerns that parents have about you going in and interacting with their child in a mandatory compulsory setting. And so understanding how much research is being done in the secondary or administrative data would be helpful. And finally, I would say private firms, there should be no proprietary data generated by students. So if there's ever a private firm that wants to say, this is the data and it can't be made available to any researcher, or there's limits as to how you can use this data, I would argue that a public school system would absolutely say, no, thank you, or find out how much more they have to pay to be able to have access to that data. So the idea that there's proprietary anything having to do with the public school is made me kind of cringe. And we, to be honest with you, we have this issue in other areas besides education. They have this issue with when you do work for the government at all, can you call it proprietary? And then finally, I think we as parents can do more to ask the county, for me, Montgomery County, and say, specifically the question I have is, what research are you making available or possible with your data? I want to know the research projects that they're doing and how are they facilitating research to understand better what's going on and kind of contributing to that research atmosphere. In addition to understanding better, and Montgomery County does not do this very well, of explaining what firms have access to the private data or to the data of the students. I would like to know that side by side, and if there's only 2 research projects being funded or being supported by Montgomery County, but there are 20 companies making money off of that same data, I think that would be interesting to see next to each other and say, well, why is that? It should be, I would say, at least a one-to-one relationship. You should have as many research projects supported as you have private companies. So those are a few of the things that I saw going on, but the biggest ones are trying to start really being clear about what we call research and a researcher, and to just, you don't have to call them different. I don't know what we call them differently, but to make certain we understand that the policies that are in place might apply to one and not to another, or to differentiate what we call research within the private firm area. Thank you.
So the conference opened up with a very nice talk from Andrew, where he differentiated between administrative and process data. I felt like most of the talks focused on administrative data. There was a panel on process data, but it wasn't until Chris's keynote that we really got into the meat of what process data is. There's a fundamental shift in the type, quantity, and power of data that we're collecting. As we're moving from traditional educational data to big data, everything changes. Eric made a point that politicians believe that researchers undervalue the probability of a data compromise and the cost of such, and unfortunately I think that's correct as we move into the big data era. At the same time, I think that both politicians and many researchers underestimate the power of this data. We're collecting fine-grained data on every student action longitudinally. Within a platform like edX, we have 4 years plus of data on students, many of whom have completed the equivalent of undergraduate education on the platform in both massive online and residential settings, and we can see when a student changes pages in a textbook, exactly what text they read. It's very fine-grained data as well, and that's across 10 million students. It's very broad data. That's across 1,000 courses. It's a wide range of disciplines. That's just us. That's one player in this ecosystem. As the data goes from things like spreadsheets or CSV files to terabytes and terabytes of data, it fundamentally changes. We saw a little bit of that with Chris. We're also seeing in different platforms as we're collecting data on social interactions. The 2 of us are talking on group projects. There are talks about the right to be forgotten. I can't forget a student if that data couples to the data of another student, whether through adaptive learning or whatever else. Chris spoke about the power to measure complex skills. That's very powerful. We're starting to get data that talks about soft skills, critical thinking skills, and that, I think, fundamentally changes almost everything. This process data is a superset of administrative data. When a student fills out a demographic survey, that is part of the process data. Not just the answer to the demographic survey, but they click this, paused for a minute, and then clicked that. Even if we didn't have that survey data, when a student writes a piece of text, we can infer from that the student's gender with very high probability. We have socioeconomic data. We've had papers looking at socioeconomic data based on IP. It's really deep, large data. And as we go in that direction, the threat profile changes tremendously. There have not been substantial breaks in educational data because educational data behaved like a very different type of data than what it behaves like right now. Right now, educational data is starting to look a lot more like the kind of data that Google, Facebook, and similar companies manage, which they manage under extremely tight security policies. That data is starting to be managed under policies of educational researchers, which are much more lax. You're asking about what incentives there are. You don't need very many incentives when data is online and you have over 3 billion people on the internet. It takes a very small number of malicious actors. It does have financial value. You have many breaks by hackers for financial value. It also has value in terms of prestige. Many teenagers try to break into systems for just that reason. The top targets there are places like MIT, NASA, DARPA, and certainly your school. Certainly when I was in high school, many of the nerds compromised.
Not you. I'm just kidding.
Many of the nerds compromised, many of my friends compromised the school's computer systems. When I was at MIT, my computer was being attacked continuously. That's a very different risk and threat profile.
But all that exists without research, right? It's not the research, it's the school has this administrative data system and the kids are trying to hack it.
But what changes is that as you go into process data, the school actually doesn't have the terabytes of process data. The terabytes of process data sit with Pearson, with edX, with Coursera, with whoever else. We make that available, but as it goes to researchers, edX data goes right now probably to hundreds of researchers. Each of those is managing it under a different set of security policies. Each of them, many have different security backgrounds. Finding ways to keep researchers maintaining this, not where the researchers are malicious agents, but where 10-20% of machines out there on the public internet are compromised, where it doesn't end up on one of the machines. That's a very hard process, and it's one researchers are not very familiar with or very educated about. That's where the risk profile goes up tremendously. There's talk about de-identification. This data can't be de-identified. That's fundamental. There isn't a balance of adequate de-identification. I think, was it Emscher who said, there's the identified data and then there's useful data? That's actually the case here. You cannot de-identify this data. You can talk to security researchers. There are good reasons for this, but someone will re-identify it when the set of attackers is that large. I don't think that there's so much of a balance between research and privacy as we need much smarter policies. We need to come up with policies that enable and allow both. The federal research centers are models that allow very complete access to data, but at the same time completely protect privacy while being more cumbersome. There are many ways that we can slice this beyond how much data do we give out to whom, more around process policy and what we do to guarantee security of that data. So I think
terrific summaries. I guess you guys are often asked to summarize meetings, so that's great. I'm interested now in turning to the next steps for the Academy, and for those of you who don't know the National Academy of Education well, we have several kinds of products and ways of speaking out about research. We have full consensus reports in which there is very careful consensus processes intended to convey the weight of the evidence. This is not what we're doing here. And that is not something that's undertaken in a field where there isn't a lot of research already, so about, for example, balancing data and privacy. So this is a workshop report that we're about to produce from this workshop, in which we can make recommendations, and they can be recommendations for the next steps for various communities, such as the research community, or they could even be broadly framed policy recommendations. We don't comment on specific laws or proposed policies. We could undertake further work. We could seek further support to create better examples of research use or more detailed examples, or to flesh out ways of controlling access and how what's done in other sectors might be useful to us. So we have a variety of things that could come out of this. The National Academy of Education is only one body that speaks for education researchers, but we believe we have, we think we have a certain cachet because, we have, over the years, made a number of important contributions, becoming a nation of readers and the like, where we have been able to speak with some force about the value and the impact and the promise of research. So we want to build on that credibility, nonpartisan, objective credibility, and do something here that's useful and that fills the needs that many identified. So with that description of the Academy, if you were us, speaking to the steering committee for this group, what would you do next? And we don't necessarily have to go in order here. Recommendations are welcome, and then we're going to ask the audience also.
So one quick thing, and this is something I am become concerned about in hearing about differences in IRBs. I don't know what the professional organization is that helps IRB. We recently had a shift in our IRB leadership, and they've become a lot more collaborative. They've simplified consent and assent forms. They're really trying to take the perspective of the people who are going to be signing this. They're really helping us understand what research is exempt, what are assumptions of privacy or lack thereof. And it worried me when I heard David speak yesterday about the legal team that's involved in the consent forms for UC Berkeley research. So I think improving IRB and sharing best practices there would be really helpful.
I think a strength. I think a strength of National Academy of Education is the ability to convene groups like this, and also you have access to the sort of the breadth of research on the topic, and can do a really extraordinary job of bringing that all together. And I think that what's lacking from many of these discussions, as we've been pointing out, is clear understanding of the terms, distinguishing and delineating how these terms are being used differently, as Kirsten pointed out, in different contexts, and what the implications of those differing uses are. The other thing that I think has come up quite a bit is that there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding around these issues, and so distinguishing those two would be useful. So I see, as far as next steps going, is really providing a strong evidence base to inform policy discussions around these issues. And also, it would be really great if it could also inform public media discussions around the issue as well. And that's just a starting point to keep talking.
Well, I think the Academy has already served a great purpose by bringing together folks from such different orientations. Particularly, I've learned a great deal from those who have come from outside of the field of education and from inside education but outside the role of researchers that have attended this workshop. And so to the extent that one of the audiences for the workshop report is researchers, I think it will be extremely valuable to represent the voices of those coming from other fields and other roles within education research. I also think it will be, as everyone has said, valuable to point towards the benefits of creating partnerships between researchers and those who make decisions in education, whether it's in government policy or superintendents or teachers in classroom. And I think as someone just tweeted, transparency builds trust. And so bringing those values to light, I think, will help create more trust between researchers and those with whom those on whom we depend.
First, Monica and Adam just made me think of one thing in particular, and around transparency. Sometimes that's talked about, and it's sometimes helpful. In companies, they think about transparency in almost two different levels. One is at the consumer user level. That's the simple notice that you might get. But there's another level where they have to be transparent to like regulators or interested investors or knowledgeable reporters, people who are advocates and knowledgeable within the field. And it might be helpful to think of, there is this consent thing that I click that says, will your student data be used in a directory? And that pretty much for Montgomery County means it would then be used forever for anything. But there is a different level of notice, which is like on the website, what's going on. And when I was talking to Montgomery County's Chief Technology Officer and General Counsel recently about it, I had to say to them, I don't even have a good place to point you to say the type of information and the level of information that people need to just understand what's going on. And I don't know, that is a need that I think a lot, and if a big county system like Montgomery County is starting that from scratch, to try to even explain what projects are going on or what relationships are going on, that would seem to be a vacuum where standards or like just the idea of helpful definitions or how to piece things out, it would be helpful. They would have the need. I would say there must be other school systems that would have the need as well.
I'll reinforce that such a report should start with defining terms. I go between many communities, physics education, research, ed tech, and words are often used in very extremely different ways, and you can offend people very nicely by misusing them within a given community. Especially the term that was used here, which I think people mean very different things by, is fundamental research. Fundamental research in each of these communities has a very different set of standards of what it means, what constitutes good research and bad research, and what's not research. I think from there, moving on to use cases for both ways that, first of all, research has improved education and how it has tied into practice would be helpful to give that perspective. And then looking at failure cases of data leaks, both of the types that Andrew had in education in his report, but also of the types that happened in other domains. For example, AOL released a data set. That data set was supposedly identified. Many users were re-identified. One who wasn't had a set of embarrassing searches. That became an internet meme sharing that. A play was made of it. Mm-hmm. It's tremendous things that happened. Experian had a leak of 200 million addresses 200 million pieces of information, individually about 100 million individuals based on social engineering. A Taiwanese con artist came in pretending to be a legitimate business trying to license this from them and then set up a website where this can be sold. So looking through use cases on both sides so we have an actual accurate risk assessment would be helpful. And then from there looking for win-wins, things that accomplish not a trade-off and a balance, but that can accomplish goals of all of the stakeholders, I think would be very nice.
Keith Kruger with COSIN. We're the Chief Technology Officers of school districts. And my suggestion to the Academy and maybe the research community writ large, and I say this in bringing an example of what the education community did to kind of reframe the conversation from privacy to trust. 2 years ago, we also were in this moment of kind of what I call the hair on fire moment, where every week there were different meetings like this, where everyone, wrung their hands about what various legislators or Congress were considering or doing. So what we did is we, in a room like this in Washington, invited all of the education associations in. and we spent a day looking at various beliefs. And by that, you know, I think what Eric was asking earlier was, what can I as an individual researcher do? And transparency is important. But it seems to me what's important for the academy and what's important for the larger conversation is to be much more clear about what you believe as the research community about the value of research. I like the way that Chris Dede started his keynote this morning by saying, you know, the reason that we are interested in data is because we want those most vulnerable children to be able to succeed. That to me is a belief statement, and I don't think that the research community has done that sort of statement. So I would, if you want an example of what the education community has done, it's called, go to studentprinciples.org. We did it with the Data Quality Campaign. We invited in about 40 national associations. The surprising thing was, at the end of the day, we did voting. We gave them belief statements, and we said, do you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree? We expected that there would, given how controversial data is, privacy is, we expected there to be great divergent perspectives. The surprise was how much consensus there was at high-level belief statements. At the end of the day, we decided that over the next 3 months it took us to work out the exact wording, but we came up with 10 parent-friendly or legislator-friendly statements about what we believe, why school systems collect data, and how we will protect data. And so that's what I would challenge the research community to do. Frankly, you're late to the table. Legislators, school boards are already out there making these decisions, and if your big concern is around trust, I can tell you all the evidence indicates that mere compliance of FERPA and IRB process isn't going to instill trust. That's a simple baseline expectation. If you want to build trust, you need to clearly articulate the why. So why are you, as a community, why is we as a society, should we care that this research happens? And I think that the concerns that, like Olga raised on the last panel about kids with special needs, you need to talk very clearly about what we believe, that it shouldn't harm, the data shouldn't harm kids too. It ought to be used to lift up, as Chris did. So that's I hope, a helpful suggestion. And again, it's at studentdata.org, studentdataprinciples.org. Great. And, you know, yes. And again, I don't think they answer specifics, but they give you a framework in which you can then look at whether an individual researcher or research project is valuable or not.
Jim Siegel, I'm going to continue on with the COSIN piece, because we definitely had our moment back in 2013 when a lot of this came up. So one of the first things that COSIN did was to build some knowledge. So we put out the privacy toolkit. And one of that did was basically provided a general grounding around people in my role with an understanding of not just FERPA, but around COPPA, which has come up today and around PPRA, which is certainly significant. It also talked about some basic security pieces. So it built kind of that basic fundamental knowledge, and I think that was something that was incredibly useful for people in my role, and I think having that would be a useful next step. One more point, and looking at the title, in terms of balancing, the one thing that I would add to that is basically the S apostrophe in students. If you're talking about balancing, you know, it's nice that we had a parent and a district person, but if you're going to talk about that balance, the conversation has been incredibly weighted towards the research in that sentence, not the students. So having information on how students define privacy, and certainly more for parents and districts and educators, but I think at the moment the equation is a little out of balance in terms of the positions.
So a couple quick things here. You know, first, oh, thanks. First is, you know, when we say things like there's never been a data breach from a research organization, that is a highly problematic statement because, you know, I mean, you can see all kinds of data breaches that occur within educational institutions. And those are, I mean, again, I'm looking at privacyrights.org/data breach, which is a data set of data breaches. And if you can actually filter on EDU, and, you know, I'm just looking for the last couple of years, and there's a slew of educational records being released. And sometimes these are actually compromises from within higher ed. And it's really impossible to say who or what has been breached. And the other thing is, like, you know, saying that we don't have this problem that affects every other vertical that is going to be a non-starter in a lot of situations. So I would strongly recommend exercising that as from our language when we talk about this.
Well, there was one in Montgomery County, a special
Yeah.
data by a researcher in November, so that certainly one.
Yeah. I would say more than one, but yeah. I mean, but the other thing is, like, you know, this is not something that also, we don't need to start from scratch here. Like, there are a lot of other organizations who have actually already done this work, and I would strongly recommend in whatever steps the Academy takes, like, reach out. Like, speaking personally, like, this is what I do. Like, I help organizations and industries actually do this better. So, like, please, like, I will use my network whatever way possible to help people who want to do this.
And ditto for everybody at
Yeah.
this table. Actually, this is all what we do.
So, I had actually never met any of these people.
Still not.
But that's just those two things. I think how we communicate and also building on the existing work. There's a lot of it, and a lot of it's actually very good.
I really must emphasize that point. I don't want you to speak alone. This is very critical that happen.
So, also in the interest of not reinventing the wheel, I think some people in this room were part of a convention that occurred 2 years ago at Asilomar, organized by people at Stanford and in help with the NSF. And there's a website that I can point you to, based partly on the Fair Information Practice Principles and the Belmont Report about ethics of using student data. There was a follow-up conference a few months ago in Asilomar, and many of the issues discussed today were the topic of that week, and more resources are going to be coming out in the very near future, you know, from the academic research community on these issues. I'll tweet the addresses for everyone.
Austin Lasseter, Summit Consulting. So I just wanted to piggyback on the fact that almost everybody on the panel referred back to Andrew's original conceptual piece at the beginning of the conference with his important distinctions, the biggest of which is the first one, where he makes a distinction between data for education and data for educational research, encouraging the conversation going forward to focus on privacy risks from educational research above and beyond those posed by educational environments themselves. And I think it's helpful that Bill points out that there are concrete examples of data breaches that occurred due to educational research as opposed to simply the collection of educational data in general. So just as we think about privacy, to think about those concrete examples and distinguish them from other data breaches of educational data that were not related to research. And I also wanted to flip it on the other side, going back to what Chris's piece this morning. Chris, you were talking more about the advantages of this new data that's now being collected for research purposes that wasn't available even a few years ago. Shifting slightly away from privacy to the fact that there are huge opportunities for educational research that were not available prior to the availability of this educational data is also a distinction that's helpful to the conversation going forward. Thank you.
Mine is short. I just want to reiterate Adam's rephrasing of the whole topic. I think that that's extraordinarily important.
if I could. When we talk about data breaches, I think everybody in the room, I'm sorry, Charles Mintz is with Civitas Learning. When we talk about data breaches, I think everybody's mind will probably go to that scenario of a hacker compromising some kind of access control to gain access to data. But in these research environments, we may have a lower security posture than we would in production environments. And so I think that data exposure is also something that we should keep in mind. It's not always a bad actor who's causing the problem, but maybe the researcher themselves. Sometimes they're working on a centralized computer, sometimes they're putting that data on their laptops and taking it home. There's always going to be scenarios where we can increase our security awareness, and that's something that we should all encourage.
So a few things very quickly. One, I just wanted to sort of echo what was said by the middle table collectively as a privacy compliance expert, been doing this for 25 years, a policy writer, a governance guider, a consensus builder, a marketer, an educator. You do not need to reinvent the wheel, and more than happy to help in whatever way I can. I also agree that by doing some of this work that may seem foreign, we've been sort of encouraging you for the past 2 days to sort of share what you do and connect with the larger community. By doing that, you will actually, as was mentioned, open yourselves up to the opportunity to do more different research than you may believe is available to you just through the connections you make. And just a minor note, we've been talking today, security breach has come up a lot today. Breach is a legally defined term. When we talk about a data breach, that is a legally defined, legally called term. And really, I would encourage you to think, as the gentleman from Civitas mentioned, think about a data incident. A data incident is not necessarily a breach. It may be more harmful and more impactful to you and the work that you do, because of the perception. A leakage of data, an accidental sharing of data can have the same impact on your organization as an actual breach could in terms of public perception and the press that you get. The Wall Street Journal article is the same, the impact is the same no matter what.
What's the difference between a breach and an event?
So an event can be just simply loss of data, misuse of data. It doesn't necessarily rise to the threshold of a legally defined breach that requires notice to the individuals and remediation and opens you up to the inevitable, usually within 24 to 48 hours, class action lawsuit.
To echo something actually Bill said to me yesterday, a good example maybe how many of you are using, sorry I'm losing my voice, how many of you are using the public Wi-Fi here, which we were informed by a really great privacy screen is totally unsecured and have sensitive data on your laptops at this moment. Like most breaches occur because of those things. It's not the malicious hacker, though those do happens. It's the human error of just not knowing that you shouldn't do that.
So, small point, is that a breach or an incident? Incident.
But it could be either, because it could actually be, and somebody could those are windows out there. Somebody could actually just set up a honeypot called Visitor, have us all sign up to it, and then, and the thing, the permission screen also says that, we're accessible to port scans. Like, how many people here are using a VPN? There are, yeah. But, yeah, these are things that, when we talk about a defensive posture, like some of these things start very, very much at home. So it's the kind of thing like, the welcome screen on this was great, but there are also things that, if anybody here has data on your laptop and you've signed up to the wireless, like that's, is anybody getting hacked here? Probably not. Is that something that we should really think twice about doing? Yes. Should we all have a VPN? Yes. Should we all be encrypting our hard drives? Yes. But these are all things that, when we talk about a defensive posture, and we can model that for people that we work with and make significant improvements in that way.
Hi, Karen Douglas from IES. I wanted to shift back to the potential benefits of education research and the message. And we've heard a lot, at least I've been pondering, about the need to assure parents and schools that they'll get something out of this. But much of the research we do, I'll call big research. It's not likely to pay benefits in the immediate future for the kids in those studies, nor for the schools that are necessarily involved. And so as part of the discussion here, how we sort of educate parents and families and schools about the need to participate in research that's not going to be of immediate benefit to them.
Yeah, just to chime in, I think it was Kristen's point that you had commented that in Montgomery County there are so many more, vendors that have access. Although I would argue about the actually selling the data, but I think it does raise a point that perhaps one of the reasons for that is that the Googles and other providers do a much better job of communicating what the value of that is than perhaps the researchers do in collecting data. I have hundreds of and thousands of teachers that are demanding that I implement XYZ product. What would it take to get to a place where my teachers and the students and the district administrators demanded to be included in one of your research surveys?
Well, it'd be interesting as I was hearing this, because most research is not a quid pro quo type of exchange. I mean, so it'd be interesting to hear a superintendent of schools to say, as a public school, we have an obligation as a public good to give back in some way, and we reap benefits from this research. It is our obligation to be a part of that research stream as well, and this is how we do it ethically. I mean, that's no quid pro quo. In some ways, in a grand scheme, it is, because I, as a superintendent, rely upon research, and this is all the ways the research that I've used, and we have an obligation, and just full stop. Because you're right. You're never going to be able to say, did my son Connor benefit from that research if he was a part of a study or something like that? And that would be a different conversation. I don't know which. I'd have to start thinking about which superintendent would be the right one to first say that. But that's a great point. I think they make a better immediate value case.
So I think that also depends on which research community you're a part of. If the research is take a bunch of data, run a regression analysis, write a paper, move on, it doesn't have that sort of immediate payback all the time, and in many cases doesn't have very much payback except for forming an academic career. If it's design research, Chris talks a lot about design research where you're implementing specific interventions in classrooms. In most cases, that does have a benefit, if nothing else, just by virtue of being in part of an experiment, students do better. But in other cases, it has even substantial benefits beyond that. And so I think part of it is how we organize so that the research does actually impact and translate into practice. Perception management is part of it, but setting up appropriate incentive structures in schools of education is a second part to make sure that the research is really meaningful that way.
I just, at Liz Albro, Institute of Education Sciences, I just wanted to react to, and I can't remember who said this, it was you, Kirsten, about the superintendents. So we actually have 2 R&D centers, research and development centers, that we're currently funding that are looking at knowledge utilization in schools, and the precise purpose of this is for us to build a knowledge base about how do superintendents, principals, teachers, I don't think students are included at this point, but how are they making use of research? And they're located, one is at the University of Colorado, and the other is at the University of Delaware. And the University of Colorado just released their first report that came out from this, which said precisely what you said, which is that superintendents and principals talk about using research actually on a daily basis. So I think we're starting to have evidence that can contribute to this conversation that's coming out. So I just wanted to share that.
Keith Kruger, just to respond to the idea of having superintendents talk about this. Actually, COSIN has been trying to create some user-friendly tools for school districts. The way and I'll have to say that, like the research community, the school districts are terrible at communicating why they collect data. And the way in which we usually communicate with parents or guardians is through acceptable use policies, which are essentially the same as your agreements you get when you download software. You get a long thing and then you have to sign something, and does that really instill any trust? So what we did last year is we partnered with the school public relations officials, and we created an infographic, which is, we encourage school districts to send out as part of their back to school. And the idea is that you, first of all, it shouldn't be from the superintendent. It actually should become, the greatest trust is at the closest place to parents, and that is their teachers and their school. So we encourage school districts to send out the infographic with a cover note from the principal, because that's somebody they know. They don't know superintendents, but they know that they want the best thing for their child. And I think the way we convey things has to be much more visual. It has to be much more simple language. And that's why we took those principles that I mentioned earlier and converted it into an infographic. It's downloadable, it's free if you go to cosin.org/privacy. It's also in English and Spanish, because increasingly parents don't speak, are not primary English speakers. But I think the research community likewise has to get as clear and crisp as we're trying to do in the education community about why is this important to us as a society? Why is it important to you as a parent? What does it mean for your child? And I don't think that you hear lots of superintendents or principals saying we don't want to be part of a bigger purpose. We just have to articulate what that bigger purpose is.
So could I just ask, Keith, is that infographic intended to be part of or to inform the informed consent process?
It's intended to be, well, they still may have to sign the acceptable use policy.
And but does it help make, or are you working on understandable acceptable use policies?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think in many ways it's an alternative way of thinking about it. They don't sign the infographic, so they still have to sign the legal document. But the idea is to, it really answers two questions. Why do we collect data, and how do we protect data? And it's in that kind of simple language. We collect data because we want to make sure we know that every child can succeed. We want to, and these are the things that why we do it, and these are the things we'll never do with your student data. We're not going to sell it. We're not going to, we're going to do everything we can to protect it. We want to make sure that your student and the teachers that work with your student are able to really make the most personalized learning experience possible. And I think if in that kind of language is what the research community needs to start framing the conversation.
I just wanted to add, there is a publication that was just released today that I tweeted out. Rachel from the Data Quality Campaign can talk a little more about what it is in the process we went through.
Thanks, Amelia. Hi, I'm Rachel Anderson with the Data Quality Campaign. So the publication Amelia is referring to that we released this morning was put together in partnership with many researchers, including a few who are in this room. And it begins to articulate the different ways in which research directly impacts education. So that might be a helpful framework, even among questions of how does this impact my child. It really goes into how research has affected the way that we in education serve individual students, the way that research has informed programming decisions, and the ways that research informs larger understanding of how children learn and what factors influence education. So even beyond the question of literally how does this impact my child, hopefully this framework can help to begin to articulate the ways that research is affecting every child.
So actually, this is a wonderful setup because I was literally about to strongly encourage people to read the Data Quality Campaign's piece. I also really agree with what Keith, he's not here right now, but what Keith said about the value statement, I think that this makes a very nice point about the value statement. Amelia and I were in the same room with a very set of very high-placed Hill staffers who could end up determining all of our futures along this topic. And one of the things that was really, really important there is, I work exclusively with school districts and states. I think it's going to be extremely important to have the principals, the value statement for research coming from principals as well. One of the things that the staffers had mentioned is that they didn't even like school districts having access to student data. And if they don't like school districts having access to student data because they think this is a contract between parents and their schools, then I think that's evidence of several steps. There's several steps in the process that we need to get to.
A couple of comments. First, a comment about all these wonderful suggestions about documents that we should be looking at. If you could post them on the Google Doc up there, that would be a way of communicating those directly with everyone. Just post the links to it would be wonderful. I wanted to pick up on this theme of there's been a lot of talk this morning about making sure that education research tells its story of, what has education research done for you lately? And I don't know why that's such a hard thing to do, because it's not as though we don't try to do that. It's not as though we go out of our way not to do that as educational researchers. And a lot of us, I try vigilantly in my life, for every 3 research articles, I try to write 1 for practitioners. Now, and we haven't mentioned so much yet. We've talked a lot about communicating with policymakers, but I want to make a bid for communicating with practitioners too. Because, and actually Adam in his comments talked about different levels of enacting policy, sort of like federal, state, district level, but there's also classroom level, and there's a sense in which classroom practice is the moment-by-moment enactment of policy that could be informed by research. I also like the distinction between research-based and research-informed. If we wait for the definitive randomized control trial before we're willing to take insights from research to make plausible recommendations based upon the best evidence available to us to inform policy and practice, we'll wait for a long, long time. But we have insights about, the most plausible explanations of what would benefit practice based upon the kind of research we've talked about at this conference, plus other, a lot of research based upon design-based research of the type that Chris illustrated to us this morning. There's a lot of good stuff out there, and we need some sort of, I don't know what it is, a set of standards for the levels of confidence we can have in our research. And I actually want to commend IES for, I've heard complaints about some of the practice guides, but one of the things I really like about the IES practice guides is that people have to fess up to the level of, they have to assert the level of confidence we have in a recommendation for policy and practice. And I think that's a great idea. You can even say, as a team writing one of these practice guides, you can even say, we're recommending this practice here, but the research base for it is not really strong at this point. It's sort of like, given the best evidence we have, this is what we should go with. But we need to be ready to change that recommendation when we have even better evidence than we currently do. And I think that's the way to think about this. And I think the distinction between research-based and research-informed helps us move in that direction. And it also recognizes the role that values and, as Adam said, policy play in determining what happens in schools.
So I'll reiterate again, and thanks to Austin for saying it. I mean, again, I feel like we keep going back and forth between data and research in a way that confounds the two. I want to ask ourselves, all of you, where we should concentrate our efforts. I think that Adam's case that he made about arguing for researcher use of the exhaust, right, the data that are already there, right, that is sort of the easiest case and absolutely one we should make to the Ryan Commission and elsewhere. It's already there. The marginal risks are not zero, but small compared to the fact that it's already being used. So we should definitely make that case. That's clear to me. Do we then say that we should also make the case for data use, not research use of data, but data use being valuable to teachers and students and parents and schools? Right? And actually, you see a lot of IES funded and William P. Grant funded and a lot of funded research where researchers are doing just that. Those, like at least 3 of the 5, or maybe 4 of the 5 of those researcher practitioner partnerships that I mentioned in my table are explicitly about that, right? Researchers going in and trying to understand how data can be more useful to those audiences. That's a difficult and dicey and dangerous place to be, because I mean the sort of elephant in the room is like, why are all these data being collected? There's a lot of summative and evaluative purpose to them, and that is a lot of what was lurking under this pushback. Right, and so I'm just sort of calling out that elephant and the dangers there. And yet I will say that I think that's where we need to go as well, not for the argument for data, but for the value of both data and research at that level. Because if we don't, then I worry that our pleas to the Ryan Commission about the exhaust are going to be useful in the near term, but not the long term. Because in the long term, the public's going to be so skeptical about measurement period, data period, right, that the data will get as exhaust to the Ryan Commission will be threatened. So the call to us is to both do what Adam says at the level of exhaust and secondary administrative data, but also extend that strategically and through a different kind of partnerships here. As both Rick and David said, we're not good at this. Right? This was not in their skill set, and in spite of incentives like IES and other, for facilitation and dissemination, in spite of those incentives, and in spite of, I love Rick Hess's Edge Scholar rankings. Have you seen those? They give credit not just to citations, but to Twitter rankings and like how often you engage with the public and policymakers. I mean, in spite of of incentives like those, this is not our skill set. So I guess I would say, I mean, we need to partner with other people like those in this room who are good at that, because we're not. But I do think that the easiest, most comfortable place for us to be is to make the pitch that Adam said, and I think we should make that. But I also think there are strategic partnerships we should employ to ensure that that long term that exhaust is still valuable. And metaphors don't quite work.
So in the interest of making sure data are still collected someday, is there any interest in this room in following up on what was talked about yesterday, a sort of different controls for different types of data? So a lot of the discussion today is around de-identified data that are in administrative databases and the like, but then we also talked about data centers and controlled access. Is that something? I'd just like to get a sense of whether that's something the Academy should explore further. Yes, no. Maybe. No, just thinking about different types of access for different types of data, and in the interest of encouraging more data collection in the future, because the controls are stricter in terms of who might access it, also in terms of not ending up with things that are not useful, because the only way to approach this is de-identification. So, Kirsten, did you? Yeah.
I just wanted to make a quick point. If you think about levels of identification or de-identification, and then you think about levels of access on a kind of a, one on the X and one on the Y axis, you can imagine a kind of a trade-off between the two. That's, I think, what we're thinking about.
And I think one thing, there's different privacy protection measures for doing research on big data sets. Some of them are the data center approach. You can look at the Census Bureau. I'm on the advisory committee for the Census Bureau, and one of the things that comes up pretty frequently is the importance of still having at least a tier of researchers or people that have access to the, they might be de-identified but non-aggregated, the individual student level data. Because one of the problems with aggregation is that minority groups and small, special, vulnerable populations get lost. And this is a problem in the Census Bureau because literally there are communities, small, kind of insulated communities in rural areas that will say, I don't want to do the census because you don't count me anyway, because they become so small they get lost in census blocks. And so, but to us that would, or to education researchers, that would be important because these are some of the vulnerable populations that we want to have served specifically, and so it's important to not only have a rule that everything is aggregated to a certain block level for any type of research, because important populations could get, quote, lost if that's the only solution. I mean, it could be a solution among many.
So in terms of different levels of access and so forth, I wanted to point out what's being done in Texas, that we do in Texas. We have a state sponsored research lab where we have essentially all the micro data that Texas produces on anything, any subject, teachers, students, whatever. And then there's a process for applying for use of parts of these data by individual researchers. There's a board to do it, and once they apply, you give them access to only the data that they're allowed and for some period of time. So it's essentially the Census Bureau model in some sense, but it's a very active thing in outside researchers. Now the problem is, of course, it's in Texas, so Texas electrons can't leave Texas, and so you have to do it in Texas only. But it is an example of a way to provide qualified researchers with all of the information.
So I think that kind of model is essential to moving forward, and it's important to find ways to position it as a win for all groups. So the edtech companies have a problem in that they are operating in 50 jurisdictions in the US and about 200 internationally, each with different privacy laws. And that's tremendously hard to manage. There is a Commerce Clause of the Constitution that gives much greater rights than Department of Education can use, which doesn't fall under that. I think that coming up with ways that you can have data centers that standardize policies for educational technology providers, reduce the risks to school districts of sharing data because you know you can put it there safely, and assure parents that this is not going to a corporate vault. There's transparency on what data is collected. Researchers, journalists, whoever else can look at it, de-identify it, but understand what it is. I think that kind of approach is essential to finding win-wins that meet all stakeholder needs.
I think that when we're talking about data sets, we're talking about different types of data sets, and most of our attention is going to the very large data sets, yet when there's instances of breaches or events, they're happening because of a laptop or because of some sort of very human error on a smaller scale. And so regardless of the types of securities we put in place for the larger sets, we need to be considering the training and security at the local level as well. And a lot of that is then putting resources into the human resource.
We have 1 minute left for for anybody who wants to make a concluding comment. Zach?
Yeah, I just want to invoke a powerful case that was in Andrew's article about Kevin Gaden. the student whose educational record was mistakenly or just carelessly left in or around a trash, and so his peers found it and labeled him. So I guess the point that I want to bring up, and I'm kind of just testing this thesis just from the license of being in this room, not because it's part of my tenure package, and that is privacy as a kind of desire not to be judged or labeled, and where's your expectation of that, right? So Kevin trusted his data with the instructors and with the administration, right, because they are in the service of learning. He did not necessarily extend that same trust to all of his peers because some of them will label or judge him as they did, right? So one of these notions of, okay, well, when should we be thinking about privacy and how does it apply to our decisions is how will our research be seen by Kevin and his stakeholders, right? Will we be seen as part of that community of instructors and administrators who are part of the service of learning, or will we be seen as people trying to cast judgment or label? And you know, part of what we do is about accountability, so it's sort of essential to evaluate, but it's also part of the educational in service of learning, right? Sometimes people don't understand that. So I guess my suggestion going forward for the Academy is when it comes to this big data era, in addition to getting down into the weeds and talking about the technicalities of data protections, also make it clear that we are in the service of learning. We are part of those instructors and administrators that are trying to help students, as opposed to we want the data so we can label you. Now these are new data, so in some sense, we don't even know what the categories are. We need to find out what those categories are. But I think that is one of the components of privacy that we should think of, and that will be essentially contested, right? Where do students and stakeholders expect that they are not going to be judged? And in those areas, who do they trust with that judgment?
But Zach, I just want to say one thing. I think there's an assumption of a relationship that that student wasn't aware of. So Kevin didn't choose to trust those people with that data. In fact, Kevin probably wasn't even aware that that data was being collected. And I think this is a really important point about choice in the data use and consent and trust. We're using these terms interchangeably a little bit, and most students, most parents, most us, we're not aware of how our data is being used and the relationships we're in with that data. And so assuming that there's a trust relationship happening, I don't think is necessarily accurate for the engagement that the student's actually having. I think he didn't know his data was there until it was in the folder in the dumpster and he's being teased about it.
I agree he didn't choose to trust the school. He had no choice about it, right? And I guess I don't know the exact details of it, but it was probably transcript data, which he would assume was captured. Right?
So what can we, as the research community, do to get on the solution side of this issue rather than on the problem side? All of these anecdotes that keep coming up are all about breaches or incidents that occur irrespective of researchers. And as Keith, I think, mentioned, we need to reframe the issue as a matter of trust rather than a matter of privacy. And I wonder if it's possible to get ourselves on the protection side instead of on the vulnerability side. I'm not sure exactly how to do that, but these problems that have come up, none of the ones that have been mentioned have been really problems caused by the researchers. So I wonder how we can get ourselves on the other side of the equation so that when school district officials or state officials say, gee, what can we do to protect our data? Maybe we should bring in some researchers because they really know how to, we really trust them. I'm not sure how to accomplish that. But
no, I think that's exactly the point, that we want to be a part of the solution even if it isn't an education research problem. It's an education problem, and it's a moral and ethical problem that we could perhaps help be a part of the solution to.
No, sorry. So a few things. I think Andrew actually helped point point to one way to help do that is to try to make the distinction that you were just making to this room, but more clearly. I think it's very tempting for people to confuse data collection in education with data use in education, with data-based policy making, teaching, everything, and research that it uses student data. Those are very different things, and it's very easy to conflate them, and that's why student privacy is often used as a hammer against education policy issues based on data. So I think really articulating that and being clear about that is very important. The other thing I would say is that the solution comes in terms of trust and things like that. I think that's not a matter just of conversation. I think people need transparency. They want to know what's going on because that's reassuring. But they also want to have a sense of accountability, that if something goes wrong, someone has their back. And those are things that can be implemented as best practices and as disciplinary tools as opposed to having something be regulatory. But that's a way to do it, which is not necessarily saying we are part of the solution, but we get it, and we don't want to put you in that place.
Yeah, also one quick point of clarification. In the example that I cited, the app was actually created by the researcher. So that would not have existed outside the research project. It was brought into existence within a research context by a researcher. So that's an example of where a researcher actually, in an effort to make the problem better, showed how to make it worse. The other piece here, though, is I think if we start to separate out what's the domain of educational research from what's the domain of education, we risk an opportunity to not model how to do this well and undercut our abilities to be trusted. Because nobody's going to solve this on their own. The only way we're going to solve this is if we all attempt to solve it. And this gets to the point that that Chris made in the panel. It's there are issues in awareness that needs to be raised everywhere, and we need to be one of the voices in this, not the only voice, not the definitive voice, but a partner voice at the table. So even if it's an LMS that's getting breached, that's not being used as part of a research project, we should still care about that because that looks a lot like research data. And to the kids' perspective who are in there, it's just the same.
So briefly, I absolutely concur with this notion of how can the research community become part of the solution as to part of the problem. Something I mentioned earlier, I think, could be a potential way to help to do it. One of the things that many people in the research community have been accused of, and many people are very acquisitive when it comes to data. You hear frequently people talking about, I have such a data set or X, Y, Z. Well, you don't have those data. You were trusted to use these data for a very specific purpose. I would personally like to see it become much easier for members of the research community to access a very stripped down set of variables that could be extremely useful for an overwhelming majority of the questions, and not impossible, but harder for members of the research community to access other types of data that may be more sensitive. And to be able for the research community to say, okay, let's maybe get a little less acquisitive in certain dimensions in order to help to create something that could be very, very valuable for a large number of stakeholders, I think would be a win-win situation.
So I'll just mention that I think if you're talking about winning trust from policymakers, going back to the discussion between Adam and Bill, the policymaker will turn to somebody like Bill and ask for their evaluation on whether this is credible. The message we're hearing very clearly from the security community is that this is the best practices used in the research community currently are not credible. They fall a couple of bars below industry best practice, and at the same time, that data is becoming widely disseminated. There haven't been many breaches because not much data has been disseminated, but as soon as it becomes disseminated, we've seen this over the past 2 decades of security, those breaches will happen, and at that point those laws will clamp down a lot more than enacting reasonable policies right now.
it can't possibly be the standard that education research should be at the same level as Citibank. I mean, who cares about fourth grade reading scores of somebody? I mean, ultimately, and
so the problem is that education research is no longer fourth grade reading scores. That's what education research was for the past few decades. At this point, we have students who are in video conferences together online, who are talking to each other on a Google Hangout and a Skype. Increasingly, we will have recordings of those. We apply machine learning algorithms to extract audio from that, do natural language processing. Students are writing essays. They're highly personal essays that they're submitting to instructors. We do machine learning on those essays to try to tag them in a range of ways. It's a lot more sensitive information than financial data, actually. That's where we're going, and we'll be more there in 5 years, more there in 10 years.
Well, I want to bring back to something that Constance said yesterday, which is that there's K through 12 and then there's higher ed, right? And one of the voices I don't think we've heard a lot from in the K through 12 space are the private companies, and thinking about, the Pearsons and McGraw-Hills and so on, and are they people that we can count on as partners in this as well? And I'm thinking about Andrew's comment about let's use the data exhaust that we already have, but that data isn't necessarily good for research as it is. So we need to be working with those companies who are selling into the K through 12 market space and being used in the K through 12, by K through 12 students and teachers. We need to be working with them to make the data that they collect better, because, otherwise we're not going to be able to have the impact that we want on students. And so that didn't clear it up, but I just wanted to make sure we have those private companies' voices at the table as well.
Hi, I'm Corinne Offeld from IES. In the work that the grantees do that I work with, a lot of them try to get data from school districts and states. And I'm hearing more and more that some of the larger school districts that have more sophisticated policies and actually researchers who work there, their IRBs or whatever they're using to approve these research proposals, they're coming back. This is to piggyback on what David Figlio was talking about. They're saying, do you really need these variables? Like for the research questions that you're asking, you can just use this subset of variables. You don't need all of these data. So they're in this conversation with the researchers to try to figure out what is the sort of the minimum amount of data that they can still answer their research question with without giving it all away. And so I think that is also sort of a best practice that hopefully going forward more districts, I know there's not a lot of resources for this, but we'll be able to use these guidelines.
I'd like to ask another question for the group, just for clarity. So I've heard that the districts and school personnel trust the security systems around commercial entities even more than they would, say, university users, that they're tight. Is that what you're saying? That a lot of the private entities which you have contracts with, vendors, have good security. I'm also hearing that researchers aren't shaping the way those entities are marking, aggregating, defining data, so that research access to those things may be limited or difficult, even though, the school district may broker the connection. The way the data are being shaped by those entities may not be useful. I'm sorry, that's not an elegant way of saying it, but Jim, did you do? Yeah.
So just to restate, and I will provide a limited agreement. So
Okay.
For the last 14 years, my job has been to test the security and privacy of the tools that we acquire in the district. And I will say, as a very broad generalization, the commercial providers have much better security. We've looked at a number of tools that are provided from the research and university community, and as a very broad generalization, those are at the bottom of the security of the things that we look at. So you're asking, do districts trust? And in my role, our approach is trust but verify.
David is pointing to his watch. So I think he and I both would like, and the rest of the steering committee would like to thank you all so much, starting with this panel, but all of you for a really incredible day and a half of rich and informed conversation that I hope we will take forward in a way that you would appreciate. David?
Just one comment, and that is, I think for those of us in the room who came at this as educational researchers, we have just benefited enormously for the interaction with those of you who are on the user end or the where you're giving advice to districts and the like. I think that voice and that perspective has really heightened our awareness of other perspectives on the sort of data quality, data privacy issues that lurk around this whole enterprise. And I'm sure that our report, whatever product emerges from this effort, will be all the better because of your presence and contributions to this workshop over the last 2 days. So let me echo Susan by saying thanks everybody for being here and for being such avid participants in the conversation.
And lunch is served, is that right, Amy? Yes. Thank you. Bye.